Hope everyone's doing well. This is Evolution PowerPoint number 2. Some of these concepts we've already talked about, but it never hurts. Don't forget to go on to Moodle and print out the document Evidence for Evolution. When you get to slide 2, this is one of those silly cartoons of the time that somebody drew because people were really in an uproar about Darwin's supposed theory that we are related to monkeys. And in fact, we do share a lot of characteristics in common. We'll talk more about that later. Slide 3, evolution really means change over time. In other words, it's a change in the frequency of a gene or an allele in a population, and that word population is so important, over time. One thing that we should mention, that even though it's known as the theory of evolution, in science this does not mean it's a guess. It's a very well supported, testable explanation of phenomena that have actually occurred out in the natural world. Darwin sailed on the ship called the Beagle. He was gone 5 years, so he had a lot of time for reading. One of the most important stops for Darwin was the Galapagos Islands, where he saw finches, sea iguanas, blue-footed boobies, and giant tortoises. One of the most beautiful quotes by Darwin: "I have called this principle, by which each slight variation, if useful, is preserved, by the term natural selection." And as slide 7 reiterates, natural selection means that those organisms that are best adapted to an environment will survive and reproduce more. So it's not enough for natural selection just to survive. Excuse me, you also have to reproduce so that your genes become more common. Slide 8, in Darwin's trip, one of the things we have to remember, I used to think that he just sailed from port to port. Anybody here seen anything interesting? And that's not the way it was. He was violently seasick, and he left the ship for weeks at a time to explore. He studied patterns of diversity of the animals in very similar environments, like the grasslands of Argentina versus Australia versus Europe, and noticed some very interesting things. No rabbits were found in Australia, and of course no kangaroos were found in England. And on this trip, he observed many species, living and fossils, and wondered why some of them were still here on Earth and some of them had become extinct. Darwin collected many fossils, and fossils are the preserved remains of ancient organisms. Some resembled living creatures, others were unlike any creature he had seen or heard of. Why had some disappeared? And how were those who were gone related to those organisms that were still living? Again, when he got to the Galapagos Island, they represented a great diversity of environment. Their environment is very different, and they're far enough apart that their organisms become very different. For example, on Hood Island, it is very dry and hot, pretty barren with very little vegetation. Isabella Island has much more rainfall, lots of rich vegetation, many more kinds of plants, and of course animals. And Darwin discovered that you could determine which island the different species of giant tortoises had come from based on their shell and their neck. For example, Hood Island, remember? Hot, dry, very little vegetation. Those tortoises had long necks that were open around the neck and the legs so that they could reach the very sparse vegetation that was available. Isabella, remember, lots of rainfall, and vegetation was plentiful, so they had very short necks because they did not have to be able to reach, and they had a dome protective shell because they did not have to reach in awkward positions. Pinta Island had an intermediate environment, not hot and dry, not quite as wet as Isabella, but they had a moderate amount of vegetation and rainfall, and the tortoises that lived there had a medium length neck. It's very, very interesting. So slide 20 is a picture of Darwin's finches that also developed in different environments on the different islands of the Galapagos. And Darwin discovered that they had different shaped beaks because in those different environments there were different foods available. There are a lot of ideas beginning on slide 21 that shaped Darwin's thinking. First was James Hutton. In 1795, he came up with a theory of geological change, and he said, this happens extremely slowly. The Earth has to be much, much older than the 6,000 to 10,000 years that theologians are claiming. Charles Lyell wrote the Principles of Geography, and he said, on this Earth, things are built up like mountains and torn down over time. And Darwin wondered, if the environment can change the Earth over time, what about life? Can life change as well? Darwin also read about Thomas Malthus' work. He was an economist, and he predicted that the human population would grow to the extent that they would run out of food and space, way before his time. But Darwin applied that to animals that he saw over and over again, reproduced for what was available. Lamarck was wrong. He believed in the inheritance of acquired traits. Slide 26 really gives a good comparison of Lamarck versus Darwin and how you interpret their two theories. Slide 27, Charles Russell Wallace was another scientist Darwin knew who worked in Malaysia, and he exactly paralleled Darwin's thinking. And he's the one that encouraged Darwin after a very long period of time to go ahead and publish his book, The Origin of Species. Both Wallace and Darwin, and this begins on slide 28, believed in 4 basic steps of the theory of natural selection. The first is overproduction. And both of them stated that each species has way more offspring produced than can possibly survive, because there's always limits to food and space and mates and anything else that's required. Darwin said there's variation. Each individual has its own special, unique combination of inherited traits. And he said if that inherited trait is something that gives you an increased chance of survival, then we call that an adaptation. If you look at slide 31, 32, you're going to see some adaptations. Really, the bird-frog combo, that's just a joke, but it does have some kind of nice adaptations. The other picture is of the Arctic fox, and we talked about that in genetics. Remember, its temperature controls fur color. When it's cold in the winter, its fur is white. When it's warmer in the summer, its fur is brown. And this, of course, has advantage because of camouflage. In slide 32, you can, if you look closely, you can see a flounder in this picture that's almost perfectly camouflaged. Slide 33, Every single individual in this photo is a member of the same species of organism. But look at the variation in their shells. So why is variation important? Well, remember, the environment changes, and variation within a species means that somebody might survive the current conditions. More variations in the types of species, excuse me, in a habitat, some of the species could survive. If you look at slide 35 and ask yourself, which community that you're looking at has a better chance for survival? The one on the left, the one on the right, and why? And it's the one on the left, because remember, if you have a greater diversity in species, you are more likely to survive. The third principle of this theory of natural selection was competition. And Darwin said, you know, individuals are always going to compete for resources that are limited because we overproduced. So we're going to have issues with food and water and space and mates. And necessarily, not all of these organisms are going to survive to adulthood. Fitness, by definition, means the ability to survive and reproduce. And that's why many times this is described as survival of the fittest. Because the fourth part of natural selection is selection. So that individuals with the best traits or adaptations survive. They reproduce and they pass along their traits. And as a result, their genes become more common in the population. One thing to remember is we select for phenotype, which can be seen, and not